I'm already back. This time we're talking about the fall of Roman power in Iberia and the outcome of that. And we'll see how far we go and still have time. The Romans held on to rule in Iberia for quite a long time, actually, because it was such a valuable province for them on account of, as I've said before, the mineral wealth and the vast agricultural fertility of the Guadalquivir Valley in, this area of Andalusia. But no great thing lasts forever. And in the 5th century AD, there was a big climate change. And this didn't initially affect the Romans too much. They had institutions that would provide a sort of cushion against famine and disease, natural disasters, and barbarian invasions. Because this was nothing new to the Romans. They were coping with all of these before. But in the 5th century, they had all of it at once, coupled with extremely ineffectual leadership. After the 4th century and the Constantinian dynasty and the Theodosian dynasty, we sort of see a degeneration of, let's say, the idea of a Roman emperor. That he should at least be strong and be able to command the military. He goes from that, the Principate, they're the first among equals. They're like senators, but the biggest senator. That's in the Principate. That's how they sell themselves. Then in the crisis of the 3rd century, the Roman emperors were really just generals, essentially. So they would be some general that was sent to the frontier. They would win a few victories. Their soldiers would proclaim them emperor. And they would march on Rome and take it from the last guy. And that would just go boop, 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 boop very quickly. Most of them never would go to Rome. And in the 4th century, they kind of had to find a way of, maybe not doing that. So they divided the empire into 4 corners, and they would have 2 senior emperors called Augustuses and 2 junior emperors called Caesars. And that actually had its own flaws, because the Roman Empire was not equally wealthy throughout. Some regions were just significantly wealthier and better than others. The main example of that being the East was significantly wealthier with fewer substantial threats than the West. And of course, North Africa was much more stable and extremely prosperous, whereas the Rhine frontier was extremely, it had its wealth, but it was not worth the cost, let's say. And Rome was kind of beleaguered at all sides. Throughout the 4th century, the Romans are just kind of struggling to hang in there. And in the 5th century, they're really struggling. Because there's this threat, kind of moving west. The Xiongnu Empire, which we sort of refer to in East Asia, had just kind of been replaced by another empire, new culture, the Shanbei, not the Shanbei, but the Huns were kind of pushed west out of northern China by another nomadic culture, and they found their way into Eastern Europe, so the region of Ukraine, Crimea, European Russia, essentially, the western part of the Eurasian steppe. And there were peoples living there, like the Goths, and then they were pushed west, and they pushed other people west, the Alemanni, the Suebi, the Burgundians, all these, the Franks, the Alans, the Sarmatians. It's just an absolute mess. Everyone's moving west. It's like, domino effect. That's why they call it the migration period. But there was a lot of violence with it. I think that's kind of euphemistic. Well, the Gothic refugees had kind of reached the Eastern Roman Empire. And rather than kind of helping them and using them more effectively, they kind of let them in, but then just absolutely exploited them and force them to sell their children into slavery for like a few bites of dog meat, essentially. That's how horrible the Romans were exploiting the Goths, just profiting off of them. Individual Romans, greedy bourgeois Romans, essentially. And by this time, the Roman Empire kind of like, their emperors had ascended almost to the point of godhood. They were no longer the first among equals. They're the representative of God on earth, essentially, as they Christianized and taken on a more Eastern sort of orientation with Christianity. So the emperors, they felt like they could do no wrong. Of course, they did a lot of wrong. Some of them were lazy, some of them were incompetent. They didn't work together, the West and the East. Long story short, the West fell. The East stayed, the West fell. And some of the groups that ended up moving into Iberia were the Swabians, and the Vandals, and particularly the Visigoths. The Visigoths just settled down right in Iberia and got very comfortable. And at first, they really agitated the local population because they were the wrong type of Christians. The Germanic peoples, of course, at that time were mostly Arian Christians rather than rather than Catholic Christians or Orthodox Christians. Rather, there hadn't really been that divide yet in between those. They were just Orthodox and Catholic were basically synonymous in the 5th and 6th centuries, or pretty much until the 11th century. So this really upset the locals at first, but then the Visigoths kind of got more adjusted to their local environment, set down local roots, ingratiated themselves in with the clergy and the culture. But at the same time, they're bringing with them these Germanic customs of heredity, almost like a proto-feudalism. But one of the big weaknesses of it was succession, and specifically the division of land. And each of the Germanic tribes had its own issues. And compared to the Romans, they would have this culture of you had this one emperor, and he chose his successor. They had more of a traditional monarchical, hereditary monarchy kind of system in the Germanic barbarian tribes. So that just led to endless, ruinous civil wars. And around that same time, in the 6th and 7th century, there was a little thing happening called Islam. And long story short, the Muslims very quickly worked their way west across North Africa. They did encounter quite a bit of native resistance, of course, from the Amazigh, but they eventually kind of co-opted the Amazigh into their power, as was typical with the Muslims. They were happy to co-opt local power into their organization as equals, or at least intending to make them as equals, along the lines of what Islam actually teaches. It was not a supremacist religion, after all. It was not an ethnic religion. It was meant to be a universal religion, like Christianity, but perhaps even more so. And that's why I think it found very easy access and very easy converts, especially in North Africa, because the people of North Africa were under the thumb of the Romans for such a long time. They really wanted to go do their own thing, and Islam gave them that opportunity. Well, as it happened, their thing was invade Iberia, invade Spain. So they did. This is pronounce the name, was one of the ones who was really leading the charge into Visigothic Iberia, and they took advantage of a civil war. So they found it very easy again to occupy large stretches of territory from an already kind of disliked foreign ruler, just as they had in North Africa, just as they had in the Middle East. But in Iberia, they weren't able to completely drive out the local Germanic lords, because as long as they were going through North Africa and southern Spain, they were encountering climates that are familiar for Middle Eastern individuals. As you can see, this is not terrifically different than what you would see in Morocco. But as you move north, it gets rockier, more mountainous, colder, just more unpleasant from a Mediterranean or an Arabic sort of perspective. And the local tribes there were much more hostile, like the Basques. And the Visigoths retreated up into northern Iberia and founded the kingdom of Asturias, which was that center of Iberian resistance against the Muslims. And while the Muslims were kind of essentially like beautifying Spain, the Christians were biding their time to get back and kind of kick out the Muslims. And this took hundreds and hundreds of years, and it wasn't a continuous process, of course. There were many alliances and marriages between Muslims and Christians. And the fact that the Iberian Peninsula was such a diverse religious landscape lent it a enormous degree of cultural wealth in music and scientific wealth, medicine, the arts. And that's why we kind of like find Spain just so gorgeous and beautified today, because it was an intersection point of different cultures. It's, you know, like Spain is kind of a Britter Morocco than Morocco in a certain sense, in terms of like seeing Moorish architecture. But as it went along, I think the Christians got more extreme, and in recompense, the Muslims got more extreme in the fight. The Moroccans had subsequent caliphates, such as the Fatimids, then the Almoravids and the Almohads, each subsequently like much more extreme in its interpretation of Islam than the form of Islam that was locally practiced in Iberia. And also gradually the Christian states such as Castile and Aragon, Leon, Navarre, they got more Christianized, closer ties to the Pope and the political power of political Catholicism, and that really meant it got very ugly very fast. So all in all, it ended very, very poorly for the Muslims and for the Jews of Spain, not to mention. In 1492, the Muslims and the Jews were all expelled from the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon. Some remained, and some also remained as crypto-Muslims and crypto-Jews, and these were the people who were targeted by the Inquisition, the auto de fe, as they called it. But at the same time, there is this legacy, culinary, cultural, scientific, that the Arabs and Amazigh maintained and brought to Spain that survived. Kind of made Spain the most advanced scientific and medical country in Europe for generations to come afterwards, at least until like the 19th century. And that's, I guess, the interesting facts about medieval Spain. Next part is early modern Spain.